Hey everyone, I hope you're well playing and are making the games that you all love. You're joining me, your host, Max Pez, but not just me. We have a very special guest with us today. We've been talking about narrative design for the last couple of weeks between us, and that lovely guest is none other than Inari. But first, let's have a quick word from today's sponsor. Today's sponsor is none other than me. What I've done, everyone, and I hope you're excited for this, is I've actually created a level design kind of store. What I've done in this store is put up different kinds of tips and tricks that you can find there, whether that be my actual ebook itself to that of level design pamphlets focused on different things such as traversal, stealth, breaking into the industry, as well as different talks that I have done which you cannot find anywhere else other than on this store. So if you are looking to improve on your level design skills and processes, then check out the Level Design store, which will be down in the description below, where there'll be a link to find this. All you need to do is head over to gumroad.com/level design lobby. I hope you like what you see, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you, and now back to the show. Thank you for joining me.
Hey there. Thanks for inviting me.
No problem. As I said, we've been talking about games firstly, but also a bit about narrative design for a couple of weeks, and I'm very excited to have you here and hear more of your ideas and more about what it is that you bring as a narrative designer, because I think it's a role people are aware of, but not always fully understanding or grasping the role so much.
Yeah, indeed. It's very hard to say what's a narrative designer today because no company's agreeing on what it actually means.
Yes, that's a really good point, actually. I think that's something we should say as well, is everyone at different companies has, sometimes a different interpretation and different guidelines of the same roles. That's a great point.
Yeah, it is, and it's especially for narrative design because everyone has a say on the story as it's the tip of the iceberg, like everyone can contact the story that is unraveled before their eyes. So everyone has an opinion, and you have to get with that all the time.
I think that was the best way to put it. Everyone has an opinion, and I think that is a big thing when working with different creatives, right? Everyone making games, the size of games that you and I work on, has an opinion. So I think that was a great way to put it. Before we go any further, actually, would you mind giving a brief introduction to you and how you got involved in the game industry, my friend?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Inari. I'm currently a narrative designer at Ubisoft Ivory Tower in France. I started be willing to work in video games for when I was 7 or 8, when I first played Final Fantasy VII. Afterwards, I just started to write what I didn't know existed, but was actually fan fiction about it, and it unraveled into becoming a universe, a whole universe of my own. And keeping playing this game, I got interested into tabletop RPGs in, I guess it was 2009, and I started working in tabletop RPGs. Actually, I've been podcasting there for 4 years, recording 30 to 40 podcasts and giving talks in conferences. So that was pretty thrilling. And that's when I discovered design is a thing that I was pretty decent at it, let's say, and that I wanted to make this my day-to-day job. So I stopped my studies, which were in foreign languages back then. I was studying applied foreign languages, and I started a game design diploma in Paris, where I had to be working in internships at the same time as I was studying. So I started an internship at Fremencorp, which is a small indie company in France, working on a project called Star Runner Genesis, which was a Facebook-oriented trade RPG. The year after that, My internship was at the Center for Research and Interdisciplinarity, where I was teaching game design to doctors and stuff like that so that they can use it to make people aware of stuff. And I was also working with them to create games about that. And rather than having my third year in my first school, I went all the way to northern Finland, to Oulu, to make my last year at the Oulu Game Lab. I worked on a project that was called Inari, which was a poetical Metroidvania. And due to financial reasons, I had to come back to France. And there I've been working for 4 years as an indie developer and freelancer. So I've been working with a different type of games, like a TV game show, a board game with an AI on phone to help you understand the rules. Serious games, like my last game was released last month, and it's about the hazards of epilepsy when you're living alone at home. And
congratulations on the game releasing, by the way.
Thanks.
That's great.
And now I'm working at Ubisoft. So that's the short, long story.
Well, honestly, that is a very cool and diverse kind of journey, shall I say. And I wanted to just ask you a couple of questions on there, because like I said, you got so many different aspects to it. The first one, when you talk about like teaching doctors, what did you find was the benefit of teaching them how to, I guess the term gamification, narrative design, like what was the purpose for it?
Well, the Center for Research and Interdisciplinarity is a very specific place because it's in Paris. It depends on the university, and people there are learning new ways to teach in general. And as game and play are the first things that teach people stuff, even animals learn through it. It was pretty interesting to have to teach them how to use games and even board games in order to improve their teaching and to help people get better in their lives. I've been working on the game back then on how to help kids between 6 and 12 take their medication for asthma. And while it was at first just an adventure game with a lot of text that you can expect from someone who hasn't been working in games for a long time, it became an infinite runner where you had to gather your medication, but also to prepare your bag to make sure you wouldn't run out of breath while running.
That's fascinating. I mean, because I suffer from asthma, and especially as a child. So that's a very like close to home topic there. And did you find that like doing this helped them understand, I guess, the importance of their medication?
Unfortunately, I don't know where the game ended because I was just working on the concept for a doctor to sell it to the health organization to get funding. And I had to leave the internship and we lost contact.
What a shame that is, because that would be so fascinating to know more about.
Yeah, I agree. When I was studying game design, because I'm a first and foremost game designer, I was really willing to create games to help people. And even today, like I've been working in restaurants and bars to pay for my studies. And even today, I don't want to just entertain people. I want to make their lives better, even if it's just for a minute.
I like that. It's interesting to say that because I think sometimes people forget how we can have an impact on that of the players' lives and also perspective. And I think that's a great one. Do you have any like examples that you look to that you believe are strong examples? Because I've got a few, but I'm curious on your take on some good examples you think are for, I guess, changing people's perspectives and communicating with the player on a deeper level.
A game that really changed me was This War of Mine a few years back.
Oh, yes, yeah, because their studio is not far from where I live, actually. Yeah, it's a fantastic game, yeah.
And it opened my mind. Like, I was complaining about serious gaming being too far from entertaining per se. Like, serious games are often ordered by clients, and those clients were not used to play. So most of the time you ended up with boring serious games. And when I saw This War of Mine, I was like, yeah, that's the kind of game I want to make. Like, this is some meaningful gameplay, something that the studio itself is involved into with the War Child Association, and I thought that this was amazing. And when I was working with the Center for Research and Interdisciplinarity, we were calling this games with a purpose because, well, every game has a purpose. Sometimes it's making money, but the purpose was the message. And game design, when you think about it, design comes from the French word dessin, which means purpose. And so a game with a purpose is a game well designed, I guess.
I love that, by the way. That is a great phrase right there. That was great.
So this was the first one that just blew my mind, I guess. And another meaningful game, I'd say, well, we talked about it already, but Final Fantasy VII. And even the 8th one changed my perspective because, in my opinion, those are two very political games that weren't afraid of speaking about things that were not necessarily talked about in video games back then.
I agree. I think that it's such an interesting perspective on all this stuff, right? Like, how do you reach that? And then politics in game, like Papers, Please, I think has a really great take on corruption in politics in all its states. So no, I think that was good. And because you mentioned Final Fantasy VII, and like I said, we spoke a little bit off air about it, I'd actually like to ask, like, how did you get into narrative design then? Because I know Final Fantasy VII played a part in that. So could you expand on that for us, please?
Yeah. So, like I said, I started writing fan fictions about it and created my universe there. And this was what got me into RPGs, like universes and making other players live new stories. And the first actual tabletop RPGs that I bought is a French one that is called Sens, which means a lot of things. It can mean sense, it can mean meaning and other stuff. And it was a science fiction game about politics and determinism. And when I started playing it with other folks and making them aware of existentialism and other very deep philosophical things, I started really getting into the game. I loved it, and I made sure I met the creator at a local conference about tabletop RPGs, and we got along pretty well. And I was like, this character is amazing, and I have so much to say about it. And it was like, yeah, I'm not sure, but we can try podcast about it. And it ended up lasting 45 minutes while he thought it would last like 20. And that's when I started podcasting with him. And the podcasts, this is called La Cellule, and it's about forging tabletop role-playing games, which are another way of considering how systems were meaningful in tabletop RPGs. And that's where I discovered design in general. And I knew that I wanted to be a game designer. But coming from this background of a very story-heavy and theoretical background, narrative design was pretty much obvious. Even though on the first day of game design, our main teacher told us, if you're here to write stories, get the fuck out. Sorry for the...
Wow. No, it's by all means, you can swear on this podcast. I'm just so confused on a teacher saying that it blows my mind. All right.
Yeah, it might have been a bit more... it might have been milder than this, but the idea is there. So I focused on game design because I loved it, and I knew that games could have meaning and that I would have my own interpretation of what they would teach me. So I continued as a game designer for a few years, even though I knew my focus was on narrative design. But you have to pay your rent, so game design was also something good. And I applied at Ubisoft Ivory Tower earlier last year. We changed the years now. And I was applying as a game designer because I was a bit in distress. Like I've I had been teaching game design for 2 years to pay my rent beside my freelance activity. And I applied as a game designer. And at some point, the game director was like, "You have a fairly narrative background. Do you want to be a narrative designer? We might have an opening." I was like, "Yeah, sure. I'm into it." And I did the test and succeeded and got in because there was no one else to challenge me on this position. So it was pretty nice. And so now I'm a narrative designer there. To be honest, my focus as a person in general is technical narrative design. I love systems and implementing stuff. The content in itself is not my forte. I can do it, but I love systems.
At Level Design Lobby, we believe everybody has a story to tell. Hobbyist or student, freelancer or veteran, we made it our mission to unite those who share our passion for creating and developing great games. Thanks to our generous Patreon backers, we've been able to do just that. So if you've already pledged your support, thank you. If not, you too can ensure the future of Level Design Lobby, helping us to create even more exciting content, collaborations, interviews, and much more. With awesome perks and rewards, whether you're a seasoned professional or just getting started, you're sure to find something for you. Want to share tips, tricks, and advice with passionate, like-minded developers? Our awesome community Discord has you covered. Fancy practicing your level design, creating strong portfolio content, and having fun? Then try our level design weekends. Or perhaps you want to individually discuss your work, hone your skills, or level up your career? Then consider our one-on-one mentorships. If you share our vision, then go to patreon.com/Level Design Lobby for more information and to pledge your support. Thank you.
And so then I guess my next question is, what is it that you do on a day-to-day basis, right? What is it that you can do to, as a narrative designer and someone who has a love for systems?
Well, it depends on the game you're working with most of the time. Currently at Ubisoft, I'm working with, without saying too much, I'm working with the content of the game, the characters, what happens in the different missions or stuff like that. I can also be taken to a higher level and work with marketing, doing videos for trailers or stuff like that.
Oh, wow. I didn't even know like narrative designers. I mean, it makes sense when you say it, but I didn't know that was something that you could do as a narrative designer. That's pretty cool.
I tweeted about it recently, so let me say it. But narrative starts with the beginning of humankind. A story starts when you start the game. And so the first contact with your game narrative might be the trailer, because the trailer is a contact and it creates expectations. And how you manage these expectations in your game is part of the narrative, if you think about it.
Yeah. I will say this, Ubisoft does some of the best trailers, in my opinion, in the industry as a whole, like from previously working at Ubisoft as well. I think how they do that is some of the better ones, shall we say.
Most people think narrative equals story. And that's why it's pretty hard to be understood when you're explaining what a narrative designer is. But our job, like I said, design is about purpose. And our purpose is to make sure the player experiences the narrative, which is the story, but also the universe and the game experience as a whole. Again, that's my take on narrative design, as many companies don't agree on this, but also many designers don't. And as a game designer that turned into narrative design and loves UX, those overlaps pretty often.
Do you know, from UX and UX is user experience, just for those who may not know, like that is something I think that is often overlooked, especially by young designers, is that because they're always focused on making something bigger. And I think that is just something that's right, is like you want the overall user experience to be the best that it can possibly be. If it's not fun to run and it feels very janky and your game is all about running, say something like Death Stranding, then it's not going to work. So I think that is a great point, and something that people should look more to is the smoother experience, the detail.
Narrative design is mostly about delivery. So if your delivery doesn't work, the story will not be experienced properly. Like you lose the pacing, you might make people laugh because of a bug when the moment isn't calling that, the moment can be very dramatic, and a bug could just ruin the experience at that moment. And that's why at Ubisoft Ivory Tower, I'm directly depending on the player experience director, because we don't have UX designers. UX design at Ivory Tower is managed by all designers, and everyone has to get actively empathetic about the player experience at that point. So being a narrative designer, working with the player experience designer is fairly interesting. And I think this should be done a lot more in our field of work.
Agreed. I think it's something that should be more spoken about and more time invested into it, because I've run into things, especially when you think about, because signposting and feedback is a part of UX design as well, making it clear when you've done something and that this is usable to the player. Just seeing how some people just don't think about that sometimes, and it is something you can look over or intend to come back to, but forget. Like, people are human, but it is a shame. It is a shame sometimes. I agree with you on that.
Well, narrative design can work with pretty much any discipline, and it's very important to go to your narrative designer if you have one, I guess, because maybe a wording could be better. Maybe there's something we can say through an animation that could improve the game by giving personality to a character that might not have been designed as something, but can just improve the uniqueness of it, you know?
Yes, agreed. And I think it is, like, as I said, the delivery can come in all forms of delivering narrative, delivering the mechanic, delivering the objective. And that is still something, it's such a fascinating one to talk about, like narrative design, because one of my games I think that has one of the most interesting narratives has to be Ico, in my opinion. And I love how, because you mentioned Final Fantasy VII, and I think Final Fantasy VII did a phenomenal job with making Aerith's death so impactful, right? And they did that by making her a part of your team for so long. It wasn't just, hey, here's this girl, which FYI, you have a super big crush on, and now she's dead. Like, they made sure that you built that connection, invested time into her best equipment, to the materia she equips. And what I loved with Ico is they had a similar approach with Yuri, because you couldn't save the game without her. You may have had to defend her and hold her hand to move through the level, but she also brought a benefit to you, the player, as well. Like, you couldn't progress, open certain doors without her, and you couldn't save the game without her as well. And I think that, just from a narrative and game combination perspective, is incredible.
Well, I haven't been through Ico because I didn't have a PS2 as a youngster, but I know this is one of the best examples of Ludo narrative consonance or harmony you can have, because you have to maintain the R1 button to hold her hand, and that's the convergence of the player and character actions in game. So that's just perfection, and it's so perfect that this game was used by a therapist to help two different kinds of peoples. One was kids with autism that were having trouble with socializing, and the other one was mothers of stillborn children. And I think this game is amazing, but I still have to do it, to be honest.
Yeah, no, it took me a while to play. A friend of mine lent me the PS3 version because I missed it as well. And Last Guardian is also very good to check out. It has some great designs on different elements too. Yeah, just that one, to me, it's weird that I've only seen a couple other games have the hand-holding mechanic, but I've not seen a game use it to such great effect as Ico.
You have Brothers, A Tale of Two Sons.
Oh, that was a great one as well. Like the whole, how the controller lays out to the very end. Brilliant.
Yeah, heart crushing.
Oh, yeah, especially when you have to swim at the end. Oh.
To get back to Aerith, one thing that made her death very impactful is that, she's a symbol for white mages from RPGs. Like, she's the only one starting in the back row. She has improved healing and stuff, but she dies at the end of a disc. And that's liminal narrative. Like, no one thinks about it, but when she dies, you change disc. Like, you turn the page, literally. And even your characters are changed when you do this. And I think this is amazing. Like, we're 14 years later, no one uses several discs anymore. But still, this is something that has to be acknowledged.
Spot on. And another example I always come back to is, even though we're removing loading screens now, right? There's not as many.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. But like Resident Evil, back when they had a loading screen with the doors slowly opening, stairs being climbed, incredible. Because again, such a great way to build the narrative, create the tension, even though it was just a loading screen.
Yeah, I thoroughly think loading screens should be part of your narrative. Like, nowadays, most loading screens are just black with an animated logo. And we live in an economy of attention. And so if you just put this in front of the player, they'll go on to Facebook or Twitter or whatever, and you lose them. And I'm actually preparing a talk about it because liminal narrative in loading screens, in checkpoints, etc., can bring so much to a narrative that not using those is a waste. Like, there's so much to be given through them. If you love cinema, you might have come to the Japanese cinema and the practice of pillow shots, which are maintaining a few seconds, looking at something that doesn't make the story progress, but gives a sense of temporality and creates anticipation or informs the spectator about what's happening in the world in general. And those are very pacing shots in general. They're mostly used by Yasujiro Ozu. I never remember his name. I had to look it up, let's be honest. But in my opinion, loading screens should get back to that, because so many, like, if you play League of Legends, when you're loading a game, you have a tooltip that might inform you about the lore of the game. Well, unfortunately, it's not necessarily about one of the characters that are in, but at least when you're waiting, you have something to read, and that can get you involved into the narrative of League of Legends, which is pretty rich, for real. So yeah, loading screens are not something that should bother developers, but some opportunity they should be taking to improve how their players experience their narrative as a whole.
I completely agree, and I'd love to see your talk when you've got it all prepared. As I mentioned earlier, Last Guardian, but they used it so well because you have these kind of like floating symbols, and you have to get them off screen. So you just tap any button, and eventually they'll disappear, and this is their loading screen. And you just think, okay, it's a way to keep the player interacting and engaged. But when the enemies actually pick up your character, the symbols come up on the screen again, and instantly you know, oh, just from the loading screen, I better start just bashing the buttons. And great way to teach, great way to keep them engaged. Dragon Age did phenomenal with the latest one. I've forgotten what it's called now.
Inquisition?
Yes, thank you. Where at the start, you've got the Templars and the mages walking towards a tower. And as soon as you hit a new game, the tower explodes and it leads you straight into the narrative. And just so well done, because I agree. Sometimes I think we as developers just take it for granted. And we're like, okay, loading screen, okay, main menu. When there's so much you can do, as you said, to tell your story, teach players, and it's such an underutilized area. So I'm so in sync with you on that.
One game that struck me recently was Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, because I'm not playing Dark Souls games, but I know the campfire mechanics are amazing. Like, I love those. And coming to Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, you go to the meditation circles and your character sits in those and meditates, and it fits so well with the narrative. It was amazing. Even Control at some point does this, and really you get involved in those. Like, when I first saw the meditation circles, I was like, yeah, I can project myself into Cal's meditation. I really want to dig into it. Unfortunately, there's not much about those, except at some points in the story where you actually get flashbacks from those. Those were nice moments of checkpoints that were meaningful.
Completely agree. And I think, as you know yourself, being a narrative designer, and you said just delivering the story, you can just deliver it on nearly any kind of cornerstone of what makes a game. As we mentioned, loading screens, menus, save points. Each one of them could be some way to help sell it. It doesn't have to just be